Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of Behind History. This week, we will talk about a very controversial and complicated topic, which is the history of the Middle East in the 20th century.
And I feel like even the most basic of questions, like what countries does Middle East comprise? And you'll get a dozen of different country variations.
Aren't you from Middle East as well, Mariana? Cyprus is, at least in my notes, also in there.
Well, I wouldn't say so. Like, we're growing up talking about European values and all, whereas sources upon sources list us as Middle Eastern. And I'm also Greek Cypriot, so that may also change the way we perceive things. But that's a good question for sure. What do we mean when we say Middle East?
Well, of course, it depends on the angle you're taking. Geographically speaking, but also keeping in mind religions, cultures, you could name quite a few countries from Iran to Iraq, Egypt, West Asia, Israel, Palestine, and add on top of that the greater Middle East with Northern Africa, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. However, from a geopolitical perspective, I'd suggest we focus today only on the territories around the four seas. So we have the Caspian, the Black, Red, and the Mediterranean Sea, as well as the Persian Gulf.
I'm still scared that's quite a lot of history to summarize in a 10-minute show.
I know, that's why I want to set the picture first. In general, we can look at the 20th century Middle East as follows. So the First World War was the era of European protectorate, where the British Empire, France, Italy were holding Middle Eastern European states as colonies. During the Second World War and after, these states were trying to gain back their independence. However, they never became fully independent, just like the European states. Afterwards, during the Cold War, there was a dualism between the US and the Soviet Union, and both of them were kind of meddling in the international affairs.
Yes, and let me start by saying that the 20th century finds several Middle Eastern countries being part of the Ottoman Empire. These countries were Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, which remained under the Ottoman rule until the European involvement in World War I. Until then, oil had been discovered in the Middle East and at first in the Persian area. In 1914, and with the outbreak of World War I, several European countries found it as the right time to take actions and intervene in the Middle East. When the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Power and became allies with Germany, it was quite predicted that the UK and France would take more actions towards controlling the Middle East. The first move was made by the UK that declared Egypt to be a British protectorate and used the country as a military and coordination base for the Middle East. Based on the actions and influence of the Europeans in 1916, an Arab revolt against the Ottomans had started. What they wanted was independence, as simple as that. In 1918, with the end of World War and the win of the Allies, the Ottoman Empire was destroyed and Palestine, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq could finally be independent.
But that wasn't actually the case, was it?
Well, of course not. France and the UK insisted that the Middle Eastern countries that were previously part of the Ottoman Empire would not be able to survive on their own in the modern world. Syria and Lebanon were taken over by France, while Palestine and Iraq were controlled by the UK.
It's curious to see that the great powers had such an interest in the Middle East. I'll take a guess and say that was because of the oil reserves and the Suez Canal and its position, for instance, the proximity to the Soviet Union.
Indeed, and let me focus on the natural resources first. So, oil and the Middle East have been highly associated from the early 1900s. That's why during the World War, their oil industry had a huge role in motivating the Europeans to take control of the region. Iran and the UK were highly involved with business issues regarding the oil in the area. Therefore, the UK, along with the USSR, invaded Iran in order to occupy the oil zones of the country and make sure that they would remain in their hands and not pass to the Central Power. The 1920s era showed a rapid growth of the oil industry in the Middle East. Then, with the rise of Hitler in Germany and before the outbreak of World War II, Middle East was already becoming very vulnerable to Axis intrigue. The region was a very important link between the Mediterranean and India, so the British really wanted to maintain their position there. Based on the British actions, Hitler came up with a way to try and undermine the British power.
Let me guess, that was by promoting the Arab nationalism.
Exactly. In Iran, a coup was organized against the monarchy, and Syria's location was vital for the British to communicate with India, which negatively affected the British when Germans were succeeding in the Mediterranean. During World War II, the US decided to get involved into the region in order to get access to its geopolitical location and keep the oil in the hands of the Allies. Their first step was to also invade Iran to protect the oil resources, which led to Anglo-Soviet and American occupation of the country throughout the war. Syria and Lebanon were invaded by the British forces in 1941 in order to stop Germany from getting access in the Middle East, and the Palestinian government allied with Germans, which created more tensions between the Arabs and Jews. By the end of World War II, British, French, and Soviet forces left the Middle East, and from 1943 till 1948, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, and Israel gained their independence.
And then, later, in 1951, Libya is also independent. To summarize, after the Second World War, there was a period of decolonization. A very important event, however, happens in 1947 when the UK, which had the Protectorate of Palestine, hands this question to the UN on the background of the Zionist movements. On November 29, partition is approved and Palestine is divided in two, granting to Jews 55% of the land. The US and the USSR quickly recognized the newly formed Israel state. However, the Arab League calls for a jihad, meaning holy war, on the Jews. In 1967, Israel gets involved in the Six-Day War against Syria following the intensifications of border clashes. Although Egypt and Jordan support Syria with troops, Israel destroys them. The entire Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip fall under Israeli military rule, and the Golan Heights, West Bank, East Jerusalem fall under the Israel sovereignty.
However, Israel doesn't get to keep them long, right? Upon pressure from the UN, Israel accepts to withdraw the forces.
Yes, and keep in mind that 5 years later, in 1973, Egypt and Syria attack Israel. And Israel is, however, massively supported by the United States and advances quickly right before the UN calls for ceasefire. A year later, Egypt and Israel sign an agreement to which the rest of the Arab world basically opposes. Another important war breaks out 7 years later, the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1989, during which the Iraqi armed forces invaded western Iran along the country's joint border. The roots of the war lay in a number of territorial and political disputes between Iraq and Iran. Iraq wanted to seize control of a rich oil-producing Iranian region. Of course, oil is in the middle of everything. Iraq's war effort was openly financed by Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other neighboring Arab states, the United States and the Soviet Union as well. Iran's only allies were Syria and Libya. In 1988, fighting ended with a ceasefire, and the peace agreement was signed in 1990. However, also in 1990, Iraq invites Kuwait in what is known as the Persian Gulf War. Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, ordered the invasion and occupation of Kuwait with the apparent aim of acquiring the nation's large oil reserves. Iraq's invasion was also a threat to Saudi Arabia, which at the time was the world's largest oil producer and exporter, and this led the United States and its Western European and NATO allies to rush troops to Saudi Arabia to deter a possible attack. And after a massive US air campaign, and by the time the US President George Bush declared a ceasefire, the Iraqi resistance had completely collapsed.
And what's happening in the Palestine-Israel region in the meantime?
The Arab world is as divided as ever. In 1988, Hamas is founded.
Hamas, which is the Islamic resistance movement in Palestine? Well, I know that they signed a declaration of independence in 1988 that the rest of the Arab states accept.
Yes, however, Egypt seems to go against everyone and recognizes Israel. And then, as you know, in 1991, we have the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And that deprives many Arab states of a major diplomatic ally and the supplier of military and other assistance. The Soviet policy of favoring one Arab group often drove the others towards the West. For instance, increased Soviet favoritism towards Syria pushes Egypt back towards the West.
And after the Six-Day War, the Soviet Union became a major player in the Middle East through its proxy countries, basically. So, for instance, the Soviets provided continued support to the Arab allies in the struggle against Israel.
Interesting to watch these US-USSR dualism evolve during this period of time. Each side had its own interests at heart, and most of the times those interests were indeed the oil reserves.
And now I feel like I know the Middle East a little bit better.
Me too, and I hope that our audience had a great time as well.
Well, thanks for being with us, and see you next week for a new episode of Behind History. Goodbye.
Thank you and good night.